Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about the incline bench as a bench press accessory. That's the thing that we have to remember when it comes over to lifters who are no longer novices. For novice lifters, we always say you need to just get strong in general. You don't have weaknesses, you don't have weak links, don't worry about it. Focus on the basics, progressive overload. As you get more advanced though, it becomes important to identify our weaknesses on a lift. And what we need to remember is that we're trying to avoid overuse injuries, because the invariable problem you have as you get more and more advanced as a lifter, stimulating new muscle hypertrophy generally requires increases in volume. And that volume usually involves extra tension because you can't just add endless sets and reps and recover. And as you get stronger and stronger, you find that your threshold for volume continues to go up in order to break homeostasis, to gain more muscle. And gaining more muscle is mandatory for gaining more strength. And again, that's something we discuss here a lot on this channel that has to be driven home. Oftentimes when you are weak on a lift and you're trying to gain more strength, it can be a case of you have muscles themselves that are weaknesses. You have an individual muscle or a set of muscles that are just not big enough to push the weight that you want to push. Now, we can do a lot with technique. We can do a lot with neuromuscular efficiency. We can work on speed strength. We can work on explosiveness. We can work on all these things. But there are limits for any given person as to how much those can increase a lift. And at a certain point, you have to just get bigger. Well, part of the problem with the getting bigger, again, we come over to is repeating sometimes the exact same movement pattern and loading parameters, and particularly ones that put peak tension, something like bench press at the bottom. Puts a lot of tension at certain points on the chest, on the shoulders, things like that. And we tend to have higher and higher chances of overuse injuries. What you find when you introduce exercise variation, it's not just about confusing the muscle the way a lot of bodybuilders and other people talk about it. It's about changing motor patterns in such a way so that we stress connective tissue and we reduce inflammation at that connective tissue by the stressors hitting things at slightly different angles. And when we do that, we reduce connective tissue inflammation and we reduce injury rates. Now, the other thing to think about when we're looking at some of these different movement patterns and we're picking the ones we're going to do, we need to be thinking in terms of that. We also need to be thinking in terms of drifting out of our bar path, because one of the other things that causes injuries when you are either lifting heavy or you're doing limit sets, because people get this idea that a 1 rep max, oh, that's heavy and that's a high risk of injury. Well, a 10 rep max is a high risk of injury too. And if you want to be efficient with training, you obviously have to start taking sets close to failure. You have to start doing limit sets unless you want to just keep stacking on more volume. So what you find is that anything that starts causing form degradation or you to drift out of your bar paths can do what? Well, it can get you hurt. And if you get strong at different angles, you get strong at different bar paths that might be directions you might drift out when something goes wrong, you actually have joint angle specificity as far as those strength goes. So you can develop strength through those. So when we're talking about something like the incline bench, this is an accessory movement that helps you with grooving a certain way. And it's an accessory movement that will help stack on muscle with a slightly lighter weight. So we'll jump into that. The whole thing with the adding hypertrophy and using the lighter weight. All right, again, we come over to our point of we need more training volume as we get more advanced to continue to put on muscle mass. We need it. The problem we run into is that volume is not just about weight, reps, sets, it's also about stimulation and recovery. Well, when you use a slightly lighter weight, even if muscle recruitment is similar, it tends to be slightly easier to recover from. So when we take something like the incline bench and you look at it, I mean, look how long my range of motion is on the incline bench, particularly with a moderate grip, like a medium grip or a closer grip. Your range of motion on that exercise is extreme. It gives a deeper stretch on the pectoral than a flat bench does. Now, arguably, it's going to work the lower part of the pec a little less, the upper pec arguably a little more. It's good on the front delts, triceps, everything else. All of those get worked pretty much equal. The lower chest still gets worked, but ultimately you're forced to use a lighter weight. You are not, even on a shallow incline like I'm using, you're not going to be able to utilize the same weights that you use for a flat bench. So you're forced to use a lighter weight, but the majority of the muscles involved have just as much muscle fiber recruitment. Again, arguing that the lower part of the chest may be a little less, but it's still getting recruited. But all the other muscles involved are getting just as much activation with a lighter weight. And we're going through a longer range of motion, getting a deeper stretch. Simply put, doing a 5 rep max or an 8 rep max or a 10 rep max with an incline bench is slightly easier to recover from than a flat bench. That makes it very valuable from a volume training perspective, right? So if you're going to have something that you're going to come in and do 5 by 5, 6 by 6, 3 sets of 10, 5 sets of 10, something like that on to add training volume to put on size, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? It makes sense to utilize it because you can do more volumes of training as far as RPE, and that's limit sets, and working with percentages of your 1 rep max for the same amount of total reps. All right, and if you can recover from slightly more total training stimulus, you're going to have a better hypertrophic effect, because we're always battling getting enough training volume to maximize muscle growth with recovering from it. There's always a balancing act there. And a lift like this can be extremely useful as a supplemental lift for that purpose, right? For that purpose. And it has to do with the fact that you're forced to use a lighter weight for similar levels of exertion. Interestingly enough, when we pause on the chest, that forces us to use an even lighter weight still. Well, that pause on the chest, especially considering you're dealing with an exercise that puts a little more stretch at the bottom on the chest due to the range of motion, particularly if you use a moderate grip like I'm doing. I'm a couple inches inside the rings, pausing on the chest, bringing it down to where I'm tucking my elbows. I'm getting the longest range of motion I can relative to the amount of weight I can use. And that pause there gives you a lot of muscle stimulation, because again, you're having to start from a dead stop. That's going to give you additional chest recruitment, because you're having to pause and then restart it from a dead stop right at that point where the muscle is stretched. And it forces you to, again, use a slightly lighter weight to get the same amount of muscle fiber recruitment. So that's a win from a recovery perspective. So it becomes really useful for hypertrophy purposes when we do it in this manner. And that hypertrophy we get from this will carry over. Now, what we also need to look at is, why is it specific to the bench press with this relatively shallow angle? A couple things to consider. Number one, it's very good for people who are a little bit weak, slightly off the chest. Like if you're a mid-range bench, like you can maybe get the weight started slightly off your chest, which pause benching and stuff like that works, but you start to slow down midway and you start missing lifts midway through the bench. If you think about the fact that this increases the range of motion and makes you work a little harder shortly off the chest due to the increased range of motion at the bottom, you're going to get joint angle specificity there. And it's thickening up the chest and the front delts and the upper chest. Well, that upper chest gets really heavily involved once the bar gets 4 or 5 inches off your chest, particularly for a max bench for a more advanced lifter. People would say, why? Why does that matter? Because what you find, and this has been looked at and researched in power lifters of different degrees, the more advanced you become and the more years of training you have at hitting max benches, the more the bar drifts closer to your face and your optimal concentric rep, bar path, as you get more and more experience at finding your levers. In other words, the novice lifter, the up and down of the bar is identical. Their concentric and eccentric rep tends to follow the same bar path. The more advanced you get, the more it varies. In other words, you have an eccentric rep of lowering it where it drifts further down on the way down. And then as you get more advanced as a lifter, the transition off the spot on your chest towards your face a little bit, which again is the direction you are going, exaggerated obviously on an incline. It's way more exaggerated than the bench. But it tends to start several inches lower down. So the difference between a person who has built their bench up to 275 versus 350 and the exact same person, usually their max bench, by that point, they've learned to drift the bar. The transition happens of the bar no longer following a straight line, but that S curve that you think of, it happens several inches lower over their course of finding their maximum leverages on the raw bench press. So what's the incline do for us? It trains us to be strong over in that groove. Well, that matters for a reason, because what happens if we misgroove? What happens when we're popping it up on that max and we start to grind in it slow and it drifts too far the other direction? Right? We tend to lose strength and we lose our follow through if something goes wrong and we're grinding. Right? The incline bench, because it does work that angle and you're used to training it, will help you avoid injury and will help you follow through if you slightly misgroove that bench in that direction. So it becomes a valuable training tool for following through at that point also. So the things that you need to look at with something like an incline bench is of when could it be a good accessory for you. If you notice it, maybe your chest and upper chest is weak on the bench and your bar really slows down when you go heavier, reach failure a few inches off the chest. In other words, you get 4 or 5 inches off the chest and then the bar slows down and you start stalling or really slowing midway, you're struggling to get your chest totally activated and your delts, and you have a weakness on that grooving position to where the groove shifts. And the incline bench can work all of that directly and help bring up that weak link as far as the muscles and the motor pattern involved, therefore making it valuable for someone in that situation. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.